What happens when a cocky police officer pulls over the wrong man? A tense roadside encounter turns the tables in a way no one saw coming. It was just past noon on a bright summer day in Dallas, Texas. The sun reflected off rows of parked cars and the glassy facades of nearby office buildings, painting the bustling street with an almost blinding brilliance. Among the sea of vehicles rolling down the avenue, one stood out. A sleek, jet-black Mercedes-Benz, gliding smoothly through the traffic. Officer Bradley Kane sat in his patrol car a few blocks down, sipping his coffee and watching the world go by. His eyes narrowed when the Mercedes came into view. A black man was behind the wheel, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. The sight made him sit up straighter, setting his coffee down on the dashboard. "Looks out of place," he muttered to himself. Without a second thought, he flicked on his siren and pulled out onto the street. The man in the Mercedes glanced in his rearview mirror and sighed as the flashing lights signaled him to pull over. Calmly, he guided his car to the side of the road and put it in park. His face betrayed no emotion as he rolled down his window, already reaching for his license and registration. Officer Kane approached with an air of authority, adjusting his sunglasses. His hand hovered near his holster, even though there was no sign of danger. "Afternoon," he said curtly, his tone carrying an edge. "You know why I pulled you over?" The man looked up, meeting the officer's gaze with calm eyes. "No, officer," he replied in a measured voice, "but I'm sure you'll tell me." Kane glanced over the pristine interior of the car, then back at the man. "This your vehicle?" he asked, his words clipped. "Yes," the man answered simply, holding out his documents. Kane ignored them for a moment, peering into the back seat like he was searching for something. The tension in the air was palpable, and a few pedestrians slowed their pace to glance at the scene. But, as the officer continued his scrutiny, the man's calm demeanor remained steady, hinting at a story much larger than what was playing out on the surface. Kane finally snatched the man's documents, glancing at the license and registration without much care. He leaned closer to the window, his sunglasses reflecting the man's calm expression. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone sharp, almost interrogative. The man folded his hands on the steering wheel, his voice steady. "Just on my way to a meeting downtown." "A meeting, huh?" Kane repeated, as if the words were somehow suspicious. "What kind of meeting requires a car like this?" The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "A professional one. Is there a problem, officer?" Kane didn't answer immediately. Instead, he ran his fingers along the edge of the documents, his eyes scanning the car again. "Nice vehicle," he said, a hint of something unkind in his tone. "Expensive. You do pretty well for yourself, don't you?" The man didn't rise to the bait. "I work hard," he replied simply. His voice carried no hostility, just an air of quiet confidence. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. Office workers on lunch break, curious onlookers slowing down to see what was happening. The midday sun bore down on the scene, amplifying the tension. Kane leaned back slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. He handed the documents back with an abrupt motion. "Mind stepping out of the car for me?" The man's brow furrowed slightly, but he complied. He opened the door and stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He stood tall, his tailored suit spotless, and his posture unshaken. The onlookers exchanged murmurs, their interest piqued, as Kane walked a slow circle around the car, eyeing it like he was appraising a stolen work of art. "Mind if I ask how you can afford something like this?" Kane asked, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the growing crowd could hear. His words lingered in the hot air, the implication hanging heavy. The man's lips pressed into a thin line before he spoke. "Is there a law against success, officer?" Kane stopped, turning to face him. "I didn't say that," he shot back, though his tone betrayed irritation. "Just doing my job." "By profiling people?" the man asked, his voice still calm but now edged with steel. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. A woman in business attire took out her phone, holding it discreetly as she began recording. The officer's expression darkened, his hand now resting on his belt. "Watch your tone," he warned, but there was no mistaking the unease creeping into his stance. "I'll decide what needs to be checked here." But as Kane reached for his radio, preparing to escalate further, the man's steady composure began to hint that he wasn't just any driver pulled over for a routine stop. Kane's fingers hovered over his radio, his jaw tightening as he glanced back at the man, whose calm expression remained unshaken. The officer took a step closer, lowering his voice but keeping the authority in his tone. "Pop the trunk," he ordered, as if daring the man to refuse. The man raised an eyebrow, his composure never wavering. "Do you have a warrant, officer?" Kane stiffened. The murmurs from the crowd became more distinct now, a mix of curiosity and unease. The woman with the phone recording inched closer, ensuring her lens caught every word and gesture. A man in a delivery uniform leaned against his bicycle, openly watching the unfolding scene. "Don't play games with me," Kane barked, his voice louder now. He gestured toward the car. "Either you open it, or I'll call for backup, and we'll do this the hard way." The man inhaled deeply, his eyes locking with Kane's. "I'm not refusing, officer," he said evenly. "I just want to know the reason for this search." "You look nervous," Kane replied, his voice dripping with accusation. "Like you've got something to hide." The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Nervous? No. Disappointed? Maybe." His words carried a weight that seemed to momentarily disarm Kane, though the officer quickly covered it with a sneer. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Kane ordered. He reached for his handcuffs, the growing tension electrifying the air. The man didn't move right away, his gaze sweeping the small crowd that had now gathered, their expressions ranging from concern to anger. A young man in a hoodie muttered something under his breath, but his words were drowned out by the murmurs. The man finally complied, turning slowly and placing his hands on the roof of the car. Kane stepped closer, one hand gripping his cuffs while the other hovered near his sidearm. His breath was uneven now, his earlier confidence slipping as the murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "This could have gone a lot smoother," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But before Kane could act, the man spoke again, his voice steady but firm. "Officer, I'd like to show you something." Kane hesitated, his hand pausing mid-motion. "What now?" he snapped, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his tone. The man slowly turned his head, his movements deliberate to avoid provoking any sudden reactions. "In my wallet," he said. "My ID. May I?" Kane narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on the cuffs. The crowd had fallen silent now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. After a long moment, Kane nodded grudgingly. Slowly. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He opened it and carefully extracted a badge, holding it out for Kane to see. The sunlight caught the polished surface, the lettering unmistakable. Internal Affairs Division. Chief Investigator. Kane froze, the color draining from his face. His eyes darted from the badge to the man's face and back again. "You're—" he started, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. "That's right," the man said, his voice cool and even. "I'm the head of Internal Affairs, the department that investigates officers like you." The crowd erupted into whispers and gasps, the tension breaking like a dam. The woman recording let out a low whistle, zooming in on the badge. Kane took a step back, his mouth opening and closing like he was struggling to breathe. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a mix of shock and fear. But as the man lowered his hand, letting the badge glint one last time in the sunlight, his expression hinted that this encounter was far from over. Kane's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the badge, its polished surface reflecting the midday sun. He blinked, trying to process what had just unfolded. The man standing before him wasn't just another driver. He was someone with the authority to dismantle his entire career with a single report. I didn't realize, Kane stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. The murmurs from the crowd swelled, some recording with their phones, others whispering furiously. A young woman in a floral dress muttered, "Serves him right," loud enough to be heard. The man tucked his badge back into his wallet and crossed his arms, standing tall and unshaken. "You didn't realize," he repeated, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. "Or you didn't care." Kane opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The weight of the crowd's eyes bore down on him, and for the first time, he felt exposed. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and it was written all over his face. The man took a step closer, his tone measured but firm. "Let me ask you something, officer," he began. "If I weren't who I am, if I didn't have this badge, what would have happened today? How far would you have taken this?" Kane swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "I was just doing my job," he managed weakly. "Doing your job." The man's voice cut through the air, each word landing with precision. "Your job is to serve and protect, isn't it? So tell me, officer, who were you protecting today? The people on the street? The community? Or just your own prejudices?" The crowd's whispers grew louder, their collective gaze like a spotlight on Kane. A middle-aged man in a business suit shouted, "Answer him!" Kane flinched, his face flushing as he looked at the ground. The man continued, his voice steady but unrelenting. "Every day, people like me are subjected to stops like this. Assumptions are made, not because of our actions, but because of how we look. Do you know how exhausting that is? To live under constant suspicion, even when you've done nothing wrong." Kane's eyes flickered upward, but he quickly averted his gaze. The crowd's judgmental stares had him cornered, and there was no escaping the gravity of the moment. His hand dropped from his belt, and he stood there, motionless, as the man's words bore into him. "I could make a phone call right now," the man said, his voice softer but no less powerful. "One call, and you'd be under investigation before you even finished your shift. But I'm not going to do that. Yet." He let the weight of his words hang in the air, the pause drawing the crowd in even closer. Kane looked up, his face pale and his shoulders slumping. "Save it," the man interrupted, holding up a hand. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe it to every person you've ever stopped unfairly. Every person you've treated like a criminal before knowing a single thing about them. Think about that." The silence that followed was deafening. Kane stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if to speak, but he couldn't muster a word. The man turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers. "I hope you're recording this," he said, his voice carrying an air of finality. "Because this is what accountability looks like." The woman with the phone gave him a thumbs up, her camera still pointed squarely at Kane. The officer's chest rose and fell rapidly, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. He had lost control, not just of the encounter, but of the narrative itself. But as the man stepped back toward his car, his calm exterior gave way to a flicker of something deeper, an unshakable determination to ensure moments like this wouldn't be forgotten. The man paused as he reached the car door, turning back to face Kane, whose shoulders were now slumped like a deflated balloon. The officer's earlier aggression had dissolved entirely, replaced by a look of quiet desperation. Around them, the crowd remained fixed, some shaking their heads, others continuing to record the unfolding moment. It was as if time had slowed, leaving only the weight of what had just transpired. "Officer," the man began, his voice now softer, but no less resolute. "You have a choice to make. You can learn from this and reflect on how you use the authority entrusted to you. Or He gestured toward the phones pointed in Kane's direction. "You can let moments like this define you in ways you won't recover from." Kane's lips parted, but no sound came out. His hands fumbled at his sides, his badge feeling heavier on his chest than ever before. The man's words hung in the air, carrying a clarity that cut through the officer's muddled thoughts. For the first time, Kane seemed to understand the gravity of what he had done, not just today, but in countless encounters like this one. A voice from the crowd broke the silence. "He's right, you know." It was an older man, his grey beard and weathered face lending a gravitas to his words. "It's time you start thinking about who you really serve." Kane's head dipped, his gaze fixed on the pavement. The murmurs in the crowd shifted from anger to something closer to pity, though the judgment remained palpable. The man stepped forward, placing his wallet back into his pocket. His movements were deliberate, calm, and confident. Everything Kane wasn't at that moment. "You're not the only one," the man said, his eyes steady on Kane. "This isn't just about you or me. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. I could escalate this, file a formal complaint, and trust me, the fallout would be swift. But I'd rather you take this as a wake-up call. Make it mean something." Kane finally looked up, his eyes glassy and his face pale. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped himself, nodding almost imperceptibly. The man didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned back to his car, pulling open the door and sliding into the driver's seat with the same calm dignity he had displayed throughout the encounter. As the engine purred to life, the crowd began to disperse, though the conversations they carried with them were far from over. A young woman turned to her friend, her voice low but impassioned. "This kind of thing happens every day. Maybe now people will finally start paying attention." Kane stood alone on the sidewalk, the weight of the badge on his chest, now an unbearable reminder of the responsibility he had failed to uphold. He watched as the black Mercedes pulled away, disappearing into the flow of traffic, leaving him with nothing but the echoes of the man's words and the judgment of the crowd. But as Kane glanced around at the faces of those still watching, he realized that accountability wasn't just about the man who had challenged him, it was about what he chose to do next. The black Mercedes disappeared into the distance, its polished surface reflecting the sunlight one last time before blending into the sea of cars. Officer Kane remained frozen on the sidewalk, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The crowd had largely dispersed, but a few onlookers lingered, their faces still etched with disapproval. He could feel their judgment like a weight pressing down on him. For the first time in his career, Kane truly questioned himself. Not out of fear of repercussions, but out of an uncomfortable awareness of the harm his actions could cause. He thought of the man's words, each one cutting deeper than he cared to admit. They weren't just about this encounter. They were about a pattern, a mindset, a failure to see people for who they really were. The silence around him was deafening, but it allowed space for a realization to take hold. Kane knew he had a choice. He could dismiss this moment, shrug it off as a fluke, or he could let it reshape how he carried himself in the badge. The man's calm but firm demeanor had left him with no excuses and no escape from the truth. As Kane finally walked back to his patrol car, his steps felt heavier. This moment would follow him, not just as a lesson, but as a turning point. For the man in the Mercedes, it wasn't about humiliation or retribution, it was about change. He had walked away, not because he couldn't push further, but because he believed that real accountability started within. His parting words lingered in the air like a quiet echo of justice. Make it mean something. And for all of us, this story serves as a reminder. We have a duty to challenge bias, to stand firm in the face of injustice, and to leave the world better than we found it. Subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and spark change.